Hello, my friends. So today, I'd like to ramble for a little bit about a really interesting essay written by Friedrich Nietzsche called On the Uses and Abuses of History for Life, sometimes also translated as On the Advantages and Disadvantages of History for Life. And to give the briefest possible summary of this essay, Nietzsche is exploring the value of history in terms of moralizing or demoralizing people. He gets into the fact that history and how we study it, what perspectives and interpretations, what facts we remember and what facts we forget, all of this can either stimulate life, it could stimulate a person or a nation, inject them with passion and give them an impetus for acting, doing great things. Or, on the other hand, it can stifle life. It can create resistance to great action. It can demoralize a people, an individual, or a nation. And I think there's so many different avenues that we can follow from that idea alone. And for example, in today's society, the fact that in Western white countries, white people are repeatedly taught a version of history that demoralizes us. And the fact that Nietzsche, 120 or so years ago, however, 140 years ago or so, knew that history could have this abusive purpose, I think should leave nobody in doubt as to the question of whether this type of history being taught to white people is done consciously and with that express purpose of demoralization. There should be no doubt whatsoever. When over a century ago, someone like Friedrich Nietzsche is writing about this very purpose or this very ability for history to either provide advantages or disadvantages to life in this sense, I really can't see how anyone could question the fact that this type of history is being taught to white people in European and European descended countries on purpose. It's absolutely done with this conscious aim in mind to reduce us, to cripple us, to cloud us with, or to encumber us with guilt and to paralyze us. So there's that avenue. There's that sort of can of worms that gets opened up by this essay. But also, a particular type of history, besides the obvious, white guilt history that we're taught, another type of history that Nietzsche talks about a bit in this essay, which he argues against, is a type of history that I didn't fully grasp until just really the last few years, that I haven't really gotten into until just the last few years of my life. And so I'm glad that I'm reading the essay now, because if I would have read this 8 or 9 years ago when I was first getting into Nietzsche, I wouldn't have really fully appreciated what Nietzsche was arguing against. And that type of history is this world process style of history that Nietzsche says is best exemplified by somebody like Hegel. And, I knew about Hegel when I was first learning about Nietzsche back in my early 20s, but what I didn't know about Hegel that I think is important to understand is the fact that Hegel did not really invent this idea of the world unfolding, the world process of the absolute playing itself out through people, through nations, and essentially leading humanity down a certain path toward some kind of apocalyptic endpoint, some kind of it has implicit within this history a sense of eschatology and divine purpose to humanity that we're all being just inexorably swept along by. That type of history that Hegel exemplifies quite well, I think, should be understood in the greater context of what Hegel was influenced by. And you can learn about this influence, at least I think what is the most important aspect or type of thought that influenced Hegel in the book Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition. And this book shows, as I've discussed previously, shows precisely how Hegel was deeply at the core of his philosophy a Hermetic, Kabbalistic type of thinker. He was deeply influenced by things like alchemy, Kabbalism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and all of these different occult traditions, occult religious traditions, are intertwined. They're basically different branches of one type of occult religious thinking. And the fact that Nietzsche is exposing, in my opinion, exposing this type of thought as roguishness, as roguery, is, I think, really amazing. And I wouldn't have fully grasped how amazing that is just a few years ago, before I started learning how deeply influential this type of you-know-who-ish occult religious thinking is present in somebody like Hegel. And I think it's relevant to today because the fact of the matter is, as I've discussed before, like in my video, Marxist History is Dishonest, there are people even working within so-called dissident right intellectual spheres online that are promoting this style of thinking. And whether consciously or unconsciously, this style of thinking of a world process of history unfolding itself on the basis of abstractions, on the basis of following the logic of some abstraction, some idea, or unfolding itself through the masses. This idea is, like I said, whether consciously or unconsciously, influenced by a type of you-know-who-ish occult religious doctrine that sees humanity as essentially, like I said, being swept along by the absolute, by some divine spirit that is leading us inexorably toward this endpoint. And one of the thinkers that Nietzsche rails against in a very funny way in this essay is Eduard von Hartmann. And Hartmann was actually a quite popular philosopher at his time, and we don't exactly see his influence in the modern age directly. He's not looked back at, people don't look back at him in the same way as they look back at like a Hegel or a Schopenhauer, but Hartmann is in a lot of ways just as influential as Hegel and Schopenhauer, in that his philosophy went on to influence Freud. Freud went on to influence a lot of the thought of the 20th century. Hartmann also influenced people like Rudolf Steiner, and Steiner's offshoot of theosophy, anthroposophy, I think is what it was called. That is part of a group of thinkers, and a type of thought that went into influencing organizations such as the United Nations, UNESCO. Look at I've done videos in the past on how these occult religious groups like the Theosophists, Theosophical Society, influenced the founders of UNESCO, and were present at the highest levels of policy-making, decision-making positions in the UN and in UNESCO. So the influence of these types of thinkers and this type of thinking is a lot more profound than people will give it credit. And Hartmann, which Nietzsche repeatedly calls a rogue, a knave, calls him the rogue of rogues. Hartmann was himself in the military. He was a military officer. He was from an aristocratic family, a high-ranking family. And I think what Nietzsche's getting at with calling Hartmann a rogue is that, in a sense, if we assume that Hartmann's project of writing his philosophy, which, by the way, I didn't specify, Hartmann's philosophy is 100% in line with this type of world process style of history, where the world is just unfolding according to this set of abstract principles, this divine sort of spirit moving history toward a definite endpoint. Hartmann is very much in line with that style of historical philosophy. And if we assume that Hartmann, which I think this is a decent assumption to make, there's, I think, a good reason to believe this, Hartmann's project in philosophy is sanctioned by and, let's say, audited in a certain sense by the military and by the elite powers that be, so to speak. If Hartmann's philosophical project is also a military project, then we see in Hartmann essentially a psychological operation. Hartmann's philosophy can be seen as a psychological operation, and that, I think, is understandable if we look at how Nietzsche sort of exposed that type of world process philosophy in the same way that I've talked about it before, as a process or a philosophy that tells people in their young, impressionable minds, it tells them that all you can do, the best thing you can do, is learn history, learn these abstract principles of the divine spirit that is leading the progress of history, learn about all these things and sort of help it along toward the goal that is already predestined. And that's the best thing you can do, is learn as much about history as you possibly can so that you can help history along in the direction that it is already predestined to go. And that type of a thing, that type of a lesson to teach an impressionable young man, definitely dampens their spirit in a way. It shackles them to a preset idea of where history is going, and it binds them and it subordinates them to the experts and authorities that are presented to them, which have already figured out these questions of where history is meant to go, how it's getting there, what the abstract principles that are sort of unfolding this process are, and to tell young men that the best you can do is to just learn from these experts, learn from these authorities, and to help that process along. So it's a very subordinating philosophy. It's a very restricting philosophy to give people. And I think Nietzsche sort of recognized that. And that type of philosophy, as I was saying earlier, I'll just end the video here because I've been rambling enough. I'm almost home. That type of philosophy is still present in the circles of so-called dissident right intellectuals online, where it comes out in places like the traditionalist school, where the world is unfolding according to a process of cosmic cycles, and that the direction that history is going in and has been going in is, in a sense, preordained, and that all we can do is sort of help along this new golden age to occur, and that there's no real group that's been responsible for bringing about the destruction of our culture, of our nations. There's no group that's really responsible for that, because it's really a part of this cosmic cycle, this cosmic process that's been unfolding. And that, I think, is a philosophy that does a good service to the elites who are responsible and who don't want great men to rise up and change that direction of history. And that really is, at the root, what Nietzsche sees in history. And I posted a quote from this essay on Twitter that I think a lot of people might misunderstand if they don't see it in the context of what Nietzsche is talking about in this essay. And that quote essentially says that Nietzsche only sees the masses in three respects. The first is as copies of great men, poor copies of great men, stamped onto poor paper with worn out plates. Then as resistance to great men, and finally as instruments in the hands of great men. And that quote, I think, really sums up the alternative that Nietzsche is proposing, the way that he understood history, which is as a process that is determined by the actions of great men. And that really it is the actions of a very small handful of great men that has determined the course of history, and not some kind of abstract divine spirit or absolute spirit, but the concrete actions of great men, as opposed to the masses of people who most commonly just sort of sleepwalk their way through life and aren't capable of this type of great activity, of great action that the great men are capable of. That, I think, is Nietzsche's alternative explanation for history, and that's the explanation that I subscribe to. And that, I think, once we start to grasp that type of historical understanding, the question naturally leads to what great men, what group of men led to the situation we're living in now. And then you start to actually ask the questions of who is responsible and where should our fingers be pointed. And, you know, by great men, I don't mean morally wonderful. Obviously, the you-know-whos that brought about the situation we're in today are not great in the sense of good, but they're great in the sense of they have been capable of profound activity, of action that has led to a great many changes in the way that society works, in the way that our culture works. And recognizing them, pointing the finger at them instead of some kind of abstract process, some kind of cosmic cycle, or some kind of world process of the absolute spirit, or the logic of some kind of abstraction. That, I think, is a major difference, ontologically speaking, as to the causative factor, the causation of what is happening in today's world. And I think that sort of shift in thinking is really necessary for us to begin to perhaps inspire some great men of our own, and to show that through great action, great changes can occur. So that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for watching.